Today we're going to talk about how you can make ceramic beads for any of your jewelry designs. So I'm just going to start with showing you these two pendants. They're two different approaches. So this one has one hole up at the top, you can see here, and you can see that the artist made a flat slab of clay, rounded it, and then they put these deep grooves in it. And the deep texture is really nice because when you glaze it, then you can put a dark color on, wipe it off, and then do lots of color. This one has two separate holes in it, and you can see there are S-hooks, and then there's a small ceramic bead in the middle, so it would hang in this direction. It's also got some cool texture on it, and it's very smooth, so it would be comfortable to wear. So those are bigger beads. You can also think a little bit smaller scales. So these are, for instance, earrings. They just have one ceramic bead with some texture on it, so they really highlight that form. This person made two bracelets, so they focused on making just really smooth round ones, and then they focused on adding some colors to make it a little more interesting. And you can see that you can play around with different shapes and colors. There are lots of options with what you can do with your ceramic beads. So another important part to keep in mind is when they get fired in the kiln, you have to put them on what's called a bead tree, which is this. So there are these specific pieces of wire that can go in the kiln and they don't get damaged. So your bead has to have a hole that's big enough that this wire can go through it comfortably. It shouldn't get stuck on it. It should be a bigger hole than what you see here. So that's why we use toothpicks when we're making the hole in our beads, so that they can hang up later on here, and then you can glaze all parts of it instead of leaving some blank. All right, so speaking of that, I have two beads that I started working on a little bit earlier today. While they were really soft, I put the hole inside of them, and so now, since they're a little bit harder, I'm going to do some cleanup stuff on them. So first I'm going to go and put my toothpick back in. It's good to not just put the toothpick through, but also do a little bit of this wiggle. And it's good to do it from both directions. So I just switched the direction where I was holding it. The reason for that is it makes the hole bigger on both sides, and it takes away any worry you might have about it fitting on that bead tree in the back. All right, so I've done a nice job with that. Now I see there's some little imperfections here, so I can work those out, usually with just a tiny bit of water on my finger. I can smooth over the surface, and that way I can get a nice clean shape. If I add too much water, the bead will get too soft and it might collapse on itself. So it's just getting used to using just a little bit of it to clean up any surfaces. Now, since this bead is also harder, it's been sitting for longer, I can also start to think about some textures that I might want to put on it. So, for instance, I have a screw here. I could do something where I press the screw in. I also have this kind of ruler edge. It's got like a scalloped edge, which could be cool. I have some texture tools. So all different tools will just make different texture on the surface, and then the glaze sits in them in different ways. I also have this texture plate here. So if I wanted to, I think I'm going to start with the screw on this round bead. I can just gently press into the screw, and I can start to get this type of patterning. Now, if you're worried about the hole collapsing, because the clay is still a little bit soft, you can always keep that toothpick on the inside just to give it a little additional support. And after I get my texture on, then I can do things like reshaping if I need to. All right, cool. So I just have a little bit of texture on each side. I'm going to go to the table here, just make sure it's nice and round. And I'll probably do one last round of just cleaning up any edges, because you don't want to have sharp edges on your bead. So I would say that one is pretty much done. It's got some cool texture. I think it will read well. If I go to my other one that's been drying, this also has a hole in it, but it's good to go back, make sure that hole is bigger. So I'm just doing a little bit of a wiggle. Okay, just to make it a little bigger. I can use a little water on my finger to smooth any inconsistencies out. And right now this has just a random shape, so I can cut and clean that up a little bit. So first I'm going to just press it against this texture plate just to kind of highlight that cool texture that I'd like to have on it. If you're doing this, you want to do it when the clay's not very wet, or it might get stuck to the texture plate. All right, so you can see I got some cool texture on there. Now let's say I wanted to have more of an angular end. I can go back with my cutting knife, and I can cut at whatever angle I want to, so I can get more precision with that shape. So I'm just going to do some kind of funky edges. Now this would be one that would hang long, so maybe this would be a piece of an earring. Where I cut, it's a little bit sharp and unfinished, so then I can just take that little bit of water, smooth it out just a bit to finish it off. Okay? So that's what you can do when your clay's harder. When you're first starting out and you just have a lump of clay, one nice thing that you can do is you can roll the clay. That gets a more round, cylindrical shape. From here, if you want to have lots of beads that are the same size, you could slice all along here to get excuse me, to get that similar shape. It might be easier to do that cutting when it is a little harder, because right now this clay is so soft that it'll distort it quite a bit. So if that's the case and I wanted to cut lots of strips, I could wait till it gets harder, like this one, and then I could go with my knife and I could slice and get multiple that are similar shaped and similar size. Now, you might still have some distortion, so you might press against the table. You can also use your fingers to go back and shape the piece of clay as much as you'd like to. Now, let's say I want this really organic form that I have here. It's just kind of a cylinder, not really perfect. Now, the next thing I do while the clay is still soft is I would go and put that needle or that toothpick through the center. Take your time with this, because you really want to make sure it's sitting in the center of the bead if you want it to be like a rounded bead. Remember, I'm going to go from the other angle too, just to kind of make sure I've got a nice hole on both sides. And then all those little crusties will go away when I add just the tiniest bit of water to the surface. Looks like I added a little too much. You can see it kind of covered up too much. So I might go back with my toothpick, roll it around one more time, then I might wait for it to get harder to do more detail work. Okay, so there's lots of different tools you can use. You can press fabric. I mean, really anything you can think of you can do to create a bead. These ones were actually pressed against tree bark, so they have a little more texture on the surface. So yeah, think about what you want to do. Make sure you make the hole big enough so that it can stand on the bead tree, and experiment a little bit, because anything can be a tool to create interesting textures and designs to make into a pendant or a bead.